He laughed in the courtroom, acting like he had won this divorce before I even walked in. Between his expensive suit, his attorney, and his new woman in the back row, Wade projected absolute power. He told everyone I could not afford a lawyer, but nobody realized I was the only person who understood how his company actually ran. I knew exactly where every dollar went, and he was about to bury himself right in front of the judge. My name is Caitlin Vance, and the first thing I heard when I pulled open the heavy oak doors of Oakhaven County Family Court was my husband laughing. It was a sharp, booming sound that bounced off the wood-paneled walls and settled right in the hollow of my chest. It was the laugh of a man who believed he was entirely untouchable. "She cannot even afford a lawyer," Wade Vance said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the sterile room. He was leaning back in his dark leather chair, the picture of absolute comfort in a tailored charcoal suit that cost roughly $2,500. His posture was relaxed, his legs stretched out beneath the heavy oak table. I walked down the center aisle, the worn soles of my sensible shoes making soft scuffing noises against the polished floor. I carried a scuffed leather tote bag and clutched 3 heavy, mismatched binders against my chest. I wore a plain navy blouse and a gray skirt, clothes meant to blend in, clothes that screamed defeat before the gavel even fell. Everyone in that room, from the bailiff by the door to the court reporter setting up her machine, looked at me and saw a woman who had already lost everything. I was the textbook definition of the discarded wife. Wade sat beside his high-priced attorney, a man whose silver hair and predatory smile perfectly matched his hourly rate of $600. They were sharing a private joke, their shoulders relaxed, exuding the kind of unshakable confidence that comes from believing you hold all the winning cards. They did not even bother to lower their voices as I approached. A few rows behind them sat Sloane Barrett. She did not need to say a word to make her presence known. She sat perfectly still, her legs crossed elegantly at the ankles, draped in an ivory silk blouse that caught the harsh fluorescent light. Her lips curved into a tiny self-assured smirk when our eyes met. She looked exactly like a woman who believed she had successfully stolen a man, a company, and a life. She had no idea she was sitting on a fragile house of cards. She thought I was just the sad, bitter obstacle standing between her and her new country club membership. I took my seat at the empty table designated for the respondent. No legal counsel, no sleek briefcases. Just me, my scuffed bag, and my 3 old binders. I set them down gently, aligning the edges with the corner of the table. I could feel the weight of their condescension pressing against the back of my neck, heavy and suffocating. The air in the room felt thick, stale, and completely rigged against me. I stared straight ahead, focusing on the seal of the state of Tennessee mounted above the judge's bench. Wade's attorney stood up, smoothing his silk tie, and launched into his opening statement. He spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a man who dismantled lives for a living, a man who viewed marriages as nothing more than bad business contracts. "Your Honor, my client has generously offered a fair settlement to expedite this unfortunate matter. As we have established in our filings, Blue Summit Freight Group is entirely the product of Mr. Vance's entrepreneurial vision and relentless labor. It is his blood, sweat, and tears that built this enterprise from the ground up. Mrs. Vance has certainly been a supportive spouse at home. Occasionally, she provided minor clerical support, perhaps answering phones or filing rudimentary paperwork when the office was short-staffed." He paused, turning his body slightly so the gallery could fully absorb his next words. He wanted to make sure the humiliation landed perfectly, intended to crush any remaining fight I had left in me. "She was a dependent wife, Your Honor. She lacks the operational knowledge, the executive insight, and frankly, the financial literacy to demand a 50% equity stake in a complex brokerage firm that is currently navigating severe market downturns. Her demands are not only unreasonable, they are a direct threat to the livelihood of the company's employees." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded tightly in my lap. I did not object. I did not cry. I let him paint me as a glorified receptionist who barely knew how to turn on a computer. I watched Wade nod solemnly in agreement, playing the part of the weary businessman burdened by a greedy, incompetent soon-to-be ex-wife. The injustice stung, a sharp prick against my pride, but I forced my expression to remain entirely blank. Let them talk. Let them build their false narrative on the public record. Judge Miriam Holt sat high on her bench. She was a stern-looking woman in her late 60s, wearing thick-rimmed glasses, her expression utterly unreadable. She did not nod along with the attorney's theatrical speech. She did not look at me with pity. She simply flipped through the thick stack of financial disclosures Wade's team had proudly submitted. The sound of paper turning echoed loudly in the quiet, tense room. Every rustle seemed to amplify the heavy silence. She stopped on a specific page. Her finger traced a line of text. She read it once, then read it again. Her brow furrowed just a fraction of an inch. Then, she looked up, peered over her glasses, and asked a very small, very strange question. Who manages system access? The courtroom went entirely still for a fraction of a second. It was not a question about money, or assets, or marital fault. It was a technicality. It was a question about the invisible architecture of the business. I do, Your Honor, Wade answered. He said it entirely too fast. It was a rehearsed, reflexive response. He sat up straighter, adjusting his expensive cuffs, eager to project absolute control over his domain. I oversee all administrative protocols, including security and software permissions for the entire company. My wife had no involvement in our digital infrastructure. I handle all high-level technical oversight. A cold, quiet thrill shot through my veins, freezing the blood in my chest. Right there, that was the mistake. His arrogant, desperate need to be recognized as the sole architect of Blue Summit had just forced him to make a fatal error on a recorded transcript. He had just claimed total responsibility for the very digital locks that were hiding his financial crimes. I said almost nothing. My silence was not submission. It was strategy. As I sat there, I mentally cataloged the documents his attorney had submitted into evidence. I saw the heavily redacted profit and loss statements. I saw the depreciated asset lists. I saw the empty corporate tax returns for the past 2 years, carefully selected to show a business in rapid decline. I knew every number on those pages was a carefully constructed lie. More importantly, I saw exactly what they had deliberately left out. There were no carrier compliance logs. There were no digital signature audit trails. There were no factoring agency remittance reports. There were no master ledger histories detailing the routing numbers where the real money was bleeding out. They had built an entire legal defense on the absolute assumption that I was too stupid to know what was missing from the record. They thought because I did not wear a tailored suit, I did not understand the game. Judge Holt stared at Wade for a long, silent moment. The silence stretched, thin and fragile, threatening to snap under the weight of her gaze. She looked back down at the file, tapped her silver pen against the dark wood of her desk, then slowly closed the manila folder. The court recognizes the petitioner's filings, Judge Holt said, her voice dry and authoritative, cutting through the heavy atmosphere like a blade. However, given the glaring discrepancies and the lack of foundational documentation in these preliminary financial affidavits, I am not prepared to rule on the temporary relief motion today. There are pieces of this financial puzzle that simply do not align. Wade's lawyer opened his mouth to protest, his predatory smile faltering, but the judge held up a single, commanding hand, silencing him instantly. She shifted her gaze directly to me. For the first time, I felt the full weight of her scrutiny, assessing the quiet woman with the cheap bag and the old binders. Mrs. Vance, Judge Holt said, her tone shifting just slightly, indicating a massive shift in the wind. I am going to hear directly from you. We will reconvene in exactly 14 days. At that time, I expect you to bring whatever evidence you have in those binders to support your claims regarding the operational reality of this business. I want to see your version of these financial records. The gavel struck the sounding block. The sharp crack signaled the end of the session, echoing through the high ceilings. Wade's triumphant smile vanished completely. replaced by a brief, panicked flash of confusion crossing his face. He looked at me, realizing for the first time that I was not panicking. Sloane shifted uncomfortably in the back row, her ivory silk suddenly looking less like armor and more like a painted target. I gathered my binders, feeling the heavy, undeniable truth resting securely in my hands. I did not look back as I walked down the aisle, past Wade, past his $600 an hour lawyer, and past Sloane. To understand how Wade dug his own grave in that courtroom today, you have to understand how we built the dirt he was standing on. I am 39 years old, but when Wade and I filed the initial articles of incorporation for Blue Summit Freight Group, I was 27. Back then, I was vibrating with the kind of reckless, electric energy that only comes from putting every single dollar you possess on the line. We did not start in a sleek glass building with an imposing receptionist desk. We started in the cramped, airless spare bedroom of a rented duplex just off Interstate 24. Our first dispatch desk was literally a hollow wooden door laid flat across two cheap metal filing cabinets we bought from a thrift store for $40. We shared a single, constantly overheating laptop, taking turns typing in an office that smelled perpetually of stale printer ink and the cheap, burnt coffee we drank by the gallon. In those days, the division of labor was not just a clever corporate strategy, it was a matter of absolute bare-knuckle survival. Wade was always the natural salesman, born with a silver tongue and a tailored smile. He possessed that rare, magnetic American charm that made people instantly want to hand him their money and trust him with their livelihoods. He was the undisputed face of the operation. He spent his days out in the bright world, meeting with prospective manufacturing shippers, signing lucrative dedicated contracts, playing 18 holes of golf on a sunny Wednesday afternoon, and talking endlessly to anyone who would listen about our projected quarter-over-quarter growth. He painted the grand, sweeping vision of what Blue Summit could eventually become, but a grand vision does not dispatch a heavy-haul flatbed truck out of Memphis at 2 o'clock in the morning. A grand vision does not negotiate a fuel surcharge when the national average spikes by 50 cents a gallon. I did that. I was the person who stayed behind the closed door in that stifling room, ensuring every single intricate gear in the machine kept turning without shattering into 1,000 pieces. My daily reality was a relentless, grinding avalanche of logistics and liability. I was solely responsible for the entire carrier onboarding process, painstakingly vetting every new trucking company that wanted to haul our customers' freight. I scrutinized certificates of insurance with a magnifying glass, making absolutely sure every independent driver possessed a minimum of $1 million in commercial auto liability and $100,000 in cargo coverage before I ever generated a rate confirmation. I fought viciously over detention fees, spending hours on the phone arguing with stubborn warehouse managers to secure that extra $75 an hour when our drivers were unfairly held up at the loading docks for half the day. I handled the complex, agonizing payment reconciliations, matching hundreds of invoices to delivery receipts, ensuring the factoring companies received their money and our razor-thin margins remained intact. When there were payroll discrepancies, when an owner-operator called screaming that his settlement was short by $250 because of an unapproved lumper fee, I was the one who dug through the digital logs to find the error and fix it before he quit hauling for us. I tracked delivery schedules across 4 different American time zones and managed the suffocating, ever-present weight of federal compliance deadlines. I have never climbed behind the steering wheel of an 18-wheeler. I do not possess a commercial driver's license. But almost every single truck that ran under the Blue Summit banner arrived exactly on time solely because of the exhausting, invisible work I performed behind a glowing computer screen. As the company expanded and we finally moved out of that spare bedroom into a sleek, modern commercial office space downtown, the narrative of our success began to subtly shift. Wade loved to hold court at our annual summer barbecues or holiday corporate dinners. He would stand at the head of the long table, raise a glass of expensive bourbon, and tell our newest employees the sanitized, heroic story of our humble beginnings. Inevitably, he would point his amber glass in my direction, wait for the room to quiet down, and deliver his absolute favorite punchline. "And Caitlin here," Wade would say, flashing that brilliant, practiced smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "She is the one who just keeps the phone from ringing too long, so I can do the real heavy lifting." Everyone always laughed. The regional sales managers laughed, the new dispatchers laughed, the interns laughed, and the worst, most pathetic part is that I laughed right along with them. I smiled, ducked my head modestly, and played the part of the quiet, supportive spouse to perfection. At the time, I genuinely thought I was being a good partner. I thought I was protecting his fragile ego, allowing him to project the image of the undisputed, self-made alpha male his wealthy clients expected him to be. I did not realize that those casual, good-natured jokes were quietly pouring the concrete foundation for my future humiliation. With every repeated punchline, my actual identity within the company was actively being dismantled and rewritten for public consumption. I was systematically shrinking in the eyes of our staff. I was no longer the brilliant co-founder who had built the operational software matrix from absolute scratch. I was simply the boss's wife, a nice, helpful lady who occasionally pitched in with the easy paperwork when the real workers were overwhelmed. It had not always felt like a slow, deliberate erasure. The early years of our marriage were genuinely beautiful, forged in the intense, terrifying heat of a shared struggle. We were a true, unbreakable partnership then. I vividly remember sitting on the bare hardwood floor of our living room at midnight on a random Tuesday, eating lukewarm Chinese takeout straight from the white cardboard cartons, staring at our very first positive profit and loss statement. We were utterly exhausted, our eyes bloodshot from staring at spreadsheets, but we were overwhelmingly happy. Wade pulled me into his arms, kissed my forehead, and whispered that we were building an empire together. We both fully believed we were constructing a real life together, a fortified wall against the unpredictable world, not just a corporate entity. We were building a legacy that belonged equally to both of us, 50-50. But time and money possess a terrifying, corrosive ability to distort reality. As the annual revenue climbed from hundreds of thousands of dollars to multiple millions, Wade's need for my visible partnership vanished entirely, replaced by his insatiable hunger for individual glory and industry recognition. I slowly transitioned from his equal partner to a silent, self-correcting administrative system. When Wade made a reckless, arrogant promise to a massive retail client about servicing a shipping lane we could not actually cover, I was the one who frantically cold-called carriers for 10 straight hours to find the capacity and save the million-dollar account. When he simply forgot to file the quarterly federal fuel tax paperwork because he was busy at a networking retreat, I quietly paid the thousands of dollars in late penalties out of a separate discretionary account and filed the emergency extensions so the government would not revoke our operating authority. I became a master at fixing his administrative disasters, averting catastrophic financial crises, and constantly preserving his flawless reputation as a logistics genius. I was the invisible safety net he never had to acknowledge, the foundation he stood upon without ever looking down. I spent a full decade meticulously keeping his hands clean and his crown perfectly polished. I absorbed the crushing stress, the late-night panic attacks, and the relentless, unforgiving grind of the American supply chain industry so he could float above it all in tailored suits. I believed my quiet sacrifice was a sign of deep love and steadfast devotion to our marriage vows. In reality, it became a slow, deliberate dismantling of my own career. By doing my job so perfectly, and by doing it so quietly behind closed doors, I effectively erased myself from the very masterpiece I had painted with my own two hands. I taught Wade, and everyone else who walked through the glass doors of that building, that my daily labor was completely invisible, inherently valueless, and entirely replaceable. I handed him the hammer and the heavy iron nails, and I quietly stepped inside the wooden box so he could build my coffin. I just did not realize the lid was nailed shut until another woman walked in to claim the empire I built. It began with a $15,000 monthly retainer and a vague, polished title. Wade introduced Sloan Barrett to the executive team during the second week of October, calling her a brand repositioning consultant. He claimed our corporate identity was growing stagnant and that we desperately needed a fresh, modern aesthetic to attract top-tier institutional investors. Her mandate was supposedly limited to redesigning our logo, updating the color palettes on our marketing brochures, and refining the slide decks Wade used for his quarterly pitches. But from the very first week she stepped off the elevator, her footprint aggressively expanded far beyond graphic design. She was suddenly copied on operational emails. She sat in on carrier retention meetings. She hovered in the background of strategy sessions that had absolutely nothing to do with typography or public relations. Then, the geography of my marriage began to shift in subtle, chilling ways. Wade started booking out-of-state travel with frantic regularity. 2 days in Dallas, 3 days in Charlotte. A sudden weekend conference in Miami that he claimed was strictly for executive networking. His flights were always booked last minute, the itineraries intentionally vague. When he was home, his arrival times stretched later and later into the evening. The excuse was always a client dinner that ran long or a delayed flight, but the scent of expensive steakhouse smoke and heavy red wine clung persistently to his coats. Inside our house, a new, impenetrable wall of digital security arose overnight. For 8 years, we had known each other's passcodes. His phone used to sit casually on the kitchen island while he cooked. His laptop used to remain open on the coffee table. Suddenly, his phone was perpetually flipped face down. He carried it in his pocket even when he walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. I started hearing the faint tapping of his thumbs against the screen over the sound of the shower running. A man frantically managing a second life behind a locked bathroom door. When I walked into his home office to ask a simple question, he would sharply slam his laptop shut, the sudden click echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. The betrayal did not announce itself with lipstick on a collar or a tearful confession. It bled into my life through the mundane, numerical language I spoke fluently. Because I still monitored the accounts payable, I began noticing the anomalies. Small things at first. I found electronic fund transfers for prepaid fuel cards assigned to dedicated lanes we were not actively running. There was a charge for 800 gallons of diesel fuel in Louisville on a Tuesday, but our dispatch board showed 0 company-controlled assets in the state of Kentucky that entire week. The discrepancies grew bolder. I processed an invoice for corporate onboarding fees that had been inexplicably doubled. Then I found the credit card receipts for a luxury boutique hotel in downtown Atlanta. The bill was for $2,400 for a 3-night stay. It was categorized in the general ledger under brand-intensive workshops. Wade had told me he was staying at a standard airport hotel to save the company money during a rough freight quarter. The itemized receipt showed room service charges for 2 people, including a $200 bottle of champagne ordered at 1 o'clock in the morning. The tipping point arrived disguised as a routine accounts receivable notification. We had a massive, long-standing contract with a corrugated cardboard manufacturer. They were our most reliable client, consistently paying their invoices on a net 30 schedule. I was reviewing the end-of-month aging report when I noticed a $90,000 payment had been rerouted. The remittance address on the master invoice had been manually altered in the system. Instead of directing the funds to our secure corporate lockbox, the money was scheduled to go to a post office box in a different zip code. Nobody had notified me of this change, and as the person who established the billing protocols, I was the only one authorized to modify remittance destinations. I printed the altered invoice, walked into Wade's glass-walled office, and placed the paper flat on his desk. I did not raise my voice. I simply pointed to the unfamiliar address and asked for an explanation. I expected him to feign ignorance, to blame a glitch in the software, or perhaps to panic. Instead, he leaned back in his ergonomic chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me with an expression of utter, freezing contempt. There was no warmth left in his eyes, only the calculated annoyance of a man swatting away a fly. "You are just arranging the papers, Caitlin," Wade said, his voice dropping to a low, patronizing register. "Do not act like you are the chief financial officer of this corporation. We are restructuring our asset streams for tax purposes. It is high-level financial strategy. I need you to stay in your lane and just process the documents as they are given to you. He did not get angry. He simply reduced me to nothing. He looked right through me, completely dismissing my expertise, my history with the company, and my role as his wife in one breath. The sheer coldness of his delivery was far more devastating than any screaming match could have been. After that day, Sloane dropped all pretense of being a background consultant. She began appearing at internal company functions where she clearly did not belong. She showed up at the dusty cross-dock facility on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing designer clothes and an air of unearned authority, silently judging the warehouse supervisors. She secured a seat at the intimate, high-stakes dinners meant exclusively for our top-tier clients and the executive board. I watched from the periphery as she laughed at Wade's jokes, her hand lightly brushing his forearm, establishing a silent, undeniable territorial claim right in front of our staff. The employees noticed, the uncomfortable glances, the sudden hushed conversations when I walked into the break room. Everyone knew, and everyone assumed I was simply too weak or too naive to see it. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle was handed to me purely by accident. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. Marcus, a veteran dispatcher who had been with us since the very beginning, came to my desk looking deeply frustrated. He was holding a stack of crumpled bill of lading documents. "Hey, Caitlin," Marcus sighed, running a hand over his face. "I need you to fix this routing glitch. I am trying to dispatch these high-yield refrigerated loads out of the Dallas facility, but the portal keeps kicking me out. It keeps telling me these specific lanes are going through a different system now. Did we migrate to a new server overnight without telling dispatch?" My heart stopped, but my face remained perfectly composed. A different system. A parallel infrastructure operating in the shadows. It hit me with the force of a physical blow. Wade was not just sleeping with the brand consultant. He was using her to build a secondary mechanism. They were actively siphoning the most profitable, high-margin freight lanes right out of our company and funneling them into a shadow entity. They were acting like a parasite, quietly bleeding the host dry from the inside out. A lesser woman might have marched into the executive suite, shattered a glass against the wall, and demanded a divorce right then and there. She might have hired a private investigator to take photos of them at the boutique hotels. But confronting a narcissist only gives them the opportunity to hide their tracks. If I screamed, I would just be the hysterical, jealous wife. So, I did not make a scene. I smiled at Marcus, told him I would submit a technical support ticket, and sent him back to his desk. I waited until the office was completely empty. I waited until the overhead lights automatically shut off at 8 o'clock at night. Then, bathed in the pale blue glow of my computer monitor, I began to hunt. I did not cry. I did not let my hands shake. I simply opened the master database, bypassed the surface-level directories, and quietly began printing out every single document, every altered invoice, and every ghost transaction that they arrogantly believed I was too insignificant to understand. The laser printer hummed steadily in the dark, churning out the paper trail of my husband's treason. Page by page, I started the meticulous, grueling process of cross-referencing. I pulled the raw lane sheets, the individual rate confirmations, the factoring notices, and the daily receivables, laying them out across the dining room table late at night when the house was dead silent. I was looking for the ghost in the machine. It did not take long to find the bleeding arteries. The absolute most profitable dedicated freight lines we operated, the consistent, high-yield runs heading down to Dallas, the steady manufacturing loads up to Louisville, and the lucrative pharmaceutical temperature-controlled shipments to Charlotte were systematically vanishing from Blue Summit's profit margins. They were not just losing volume due to a bad market. The lanes were being cleanly, surgically excised from our books. And right in the negative space where that revenue used to sit, a new entity began leaving faint, careless fingerprints. It was a vendor name I had never approved, buried deep in the accounting subledgers. Southacre Root Partners, Limited Liability Company. It had never been announced in any executive brief. It had never been vetted through my rigorous compliance protocols. Yet, According to the routing histories I managed to salvage, this phantom company was suddenly receiving direct payments from the exact same corporate clients that had belonged exclusively to Blue Summit just 3 weeks prior. I spent 4 hours on a Saturday afternoon navigating the labyrinth of the Secretary of State Business Registry database. When I pulled the formation documents for South Acre, I recognized the registered agent immediately. The name was Thomas Barrett. It was Sloane's younger brother. But Thomas Barrett was a 24-year-old personal trainer living in a rented apartment in Austin. He did not know the first thing about interstate freight brokerage or commercial supply chains. I dug deeper into the public filings, pulling the Associated Correspondence records. The registered mailing address was a commercial post office box located exactly 2 miles from our downtown office. The recovery email address linked to the corporate domain was heavily encrypted, but the secondary notification ping led straight to an IP address I knew by heart. It was Wade's personal secure server. That was the moment the physical reality of the situation finally eclipsed the emotional betrayal. The air in the room felt suddenly very thin and very cold. This was not a midlife crisis. This was not simply a husband losing his head over a younger, sharper woman in a silk blouse. This was a premeditated, highly orchestrated financial assassination. Wade was methodically draining the massive equity of our marriage before he pulled the trigger on a divorce. Every single anomaly I had noticed over the past 6 months suddenly snapped into a terrifying, cohesive grid. The $15,000 monthly consulting fees paid to Sloane, the exorbitant charges labeled as lane migration software, the bloated expense reports categorized as client development in luxury boutique hotels. None of it was corporate waste. It was all calculated capital flight. Every dollar was a deliberate pipeline, siphoning the hard-earned liquidity from our shared marital assets directly into a brand-new, legally isolated corporate structure disguised as a vendor. He was using Blue Summit revenue to build its own replacement, ensuring that when the time came to split our assets 50-50, he would be handing me half of a hollowed-out, debt-ridden shell, while he walked away with the actual golden goose safely hidden under the South Acre banner. I became a ghost in my own home. Wade would walk through the front door at 9 o'clock at night, smelling of gin and his new life, and I would greet him with a placid, perfectly constructed smile. I would ask about his day, feign interest in his complaints about the declining spot market rates, and pour him a glass of water. Then, when he finally fell asleep, heavily sedated by his own arrogance, I would slip out of bed. I would power up my ancient personal laptop and dive back into the digital labyrinth. I needed to corroborate the digital trail with physical evidence. I started doing drive-bys of the loading docks for our biggest former clients. I parked my car 2 blocks away from the Louisville manufacturing plant, sitting in the freezing cold with a pair of binoculars and a thermos of black coffee. I watched the heavy-duty flatbed trucks roll through the security gates. I wrote down the Department of Transportation numbers painted on the sides of the cabs. Later, I ran those numbers through the federal database. They were the exact same owner-operators who used to haul for Blue Summit, but when I checked our internal dispatch board, those trucks were listed as inactive. They were hauling the exact same freight, from the exact same docks, but the billing was being routed entirely through South Acre. I needed a physical representation of the theft, something tangible that I could trace with my own 2 hands to ensure I was not losing my mind. I cleared out the deep walk-in closet in the guest bedroom, a room Wade never entered. I bought 3 massive corkboards, pushing them to the back wall behind a row of heavy winter coats. This became my secret timeline. I used red index cards for the missing freight lanes, blue cards for the altered remittance addresses, and yellow cards for every suspicious wire transfer. I pinned them up by the exact day, by the specific route, and by the individual client. I took a spool of black thread and began connecting the corresponding dates. A $50,000 invoice diverted on a Tuesday connected directly to a mysterious South Acre deposit on a Thursday. A sudden drop in the Charlotte Lane volume aligned perfectly with a luxury hotel charge in Atlanta, where Wade was supposedly negotiating carrier rates. I found a wire transfer for $82,450 that was labeled as an emergency carrier advance. but there was no corresponding breakdown of which trucks received the advance. Instead, the routing number attached to the wire led to a regional bank in Austin, Texas, the exact same city where Sloane's brother lived. The wall became a chaotic, undeniable map of a corporate heist. I stood back in the dim light of the closet, staring at the intricate web of deceit my husband had woven around me. My mind became a steel trap for numbers. I could recite the tax identification number for South Acre from memory. I knew exactly how much revenue was bleeding out per week, an average of $120,000 just evaporating into the ether. I realized Wade was trying to crash Blue Summit on purpose. If the company showed massive losses on paper during the divorce discovery phase, its valuation would plummet. He could buy out my half for pennies on the dollar, citing a distressed market and terrible corporate debt, while secretly holding the stolen contracts and the real cash flow in his shadow company. For the first time in 3 years, I stopped asking myself the pathetic, agonizing questions. I stopped wondering why I was not enough for him. I stopped agonizing over what I could have done differently to save our partnership or make him love me again. The grief evaporated entirely, burned away by a cold, hard, and absolute clarity. The question was no longer why he did it. The only question that mattered now was how I was going to prove it. I did not get the chance to confront him. Before I could even finish compiling the master ledger on my secret corkboard, Wade struck. He did not yell. He did not pack a bag and leave in the middle of the night. He simply began closing the doors of my own life, one by one, while I was still standing inside. It started on a Tuesday evening. I pulled into our driveway at exactly 6:15, exhausted from a day of quietly gathering routing data. I reached up and pressed the button on the visor to open the garage door. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. Still nothing. I got out of my car, walked up to the exterior keypad, and typed in the 4-digit code we had used for 7 years. A red light blinked back at me. Invalid. He had changed the code and simply decided not to tell me. I walked around to the front door, my keys feeling heavy in my hand, and let myself in. The house was perfectly quiet. I sat down on the sofa and pulled out my phone to text him, only to see the words, "No service," stranded in the upper left corner of the screen. He had severed my line from our joint family mobile plan. A cold dread started to pool in my stomach. I opened my laptop and tried to log into the Blue Summit master payroll system to check the weekly carrier disbursements. Access denied. I typed my password again, slower this time. The screen flashed a glaring message stating my account had been disabled and directing me to contact the system administrator. I was the system administrator, or at least, I had been until that very morning. My corporate email address, the one I had created in that cramped spare bedroom a decade ago, simply no longer existed. All the vendor templates, the compliance files, and the insurance databases I had personally built from scratch were now locked behind a new administrative firewall. The next morning, I drove to the office, determined to demand my access back. But when I walked through the glass double doors, the receptionist, a young woman I had personally hired and trained, looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe discomfort. She stammered, looking down at her desk, unable to meet my eyes. She told me Wade had held a mandatory all-staff meeting at 8 o'clock sharp. He had stood in front of the people I had worked alongside for years and delivered a somber, deeply sympathetic speech about my fragile mental health. He told them I was taking an indefinite medical leave of absence due to severe personal stress. He painted a picture of a wife crumbling under the pressure of the industry, a woman who simply could not handle the operational tempo anymore. With one short, calculated speech, he transformed me from a founding partner into a tragic, unstable liability. He made me an outsider in the very fortress I had constructed. I turned around and walked out before security could be called. The psychological warfare quickly bled into our physical space. Wade stopped pretending. He stopped hiding his tracks because he believed he had already won. I began finding the arrogant, undeniable traces of Sloane Barrett inside my own home. A sleek, black garment bag bearing the logo of a high-end boutique appeared draped over the back of the living room armchair. A heavy glass jar candle with a cloying, expensive scent of amber and cedarwood burned on the kitchen island, a smell that made my stomach turn. There were imported sparkling water bottles in my refrigerator that I had not purchased. She was leaving her scent, her items, her territorial markers right in the open. Fully aware that I was powerless to throw them out without looking like the crazy, jealous wife Wade was already telling everyone I was. The killing blow was delivered on a Thursday evening. Wade walked into the kitchen, wearing a perfectly pressed suit, looking incredibly bored. He tossed a thick manila envelope onto the marble counter. He did not look at me. He just poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the sink. Inside the envelope was a preliminary settlement agreement, drafted by his expensive attorney. It was a masterclass in financial insult. The document generously offered me a meager monthly living allowance for exactly 12 months, provided I signed the papers immediately and completely waived my right to any formal audit or forensic accounting of Blue Summit Freight Group. The attached business valuation was a sick joke. It assessed the company's worth at a fraction of its actual annual revenue, heavily emphasizing fabricated debts and depreciated assets. He was trying to buy 10 years of my life, my intellectual property, and my foundational labor for the price of some used living room furniture. The paperwork literally stated that my contributions were limited to domestic support. "Let us be reasonable, Caitlin," Wade said, his voice smooth and entirely empty. "The freight market is tanking. The company is basically underwater. I am offering to take on all the corporate debt myself so you can have a clean break. Take the allowance. Go find a quiet apartment. Do not drag this out into an ugly legal battle you absolutely cannot afford to fight." I did not argue. I put the papers back in the envelope and walked away. The true depth of his control hit me 2 days later at the grocery store. I was standing in the checkout lane with a cart full of basic necessities. The total was $142. I swiped our joint debit card. The machine beeped a harsh, flat tone. Declined. I tried a joint credit card. Declined. The teenage cashier looked at me with bored impatience while the line of people behind me shifted uncomfortably. He had frozen the accounts. He had cut off my access to the money I had helped earn. The humiliation was hot and sharp, burning the back of my neck. I quietly apologized to the cashier, left the full cart sitting right there in the aisle, and walked out the automatic sliding doors into the bright afternoon sun. I walked straight to my car. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a luxury for women who had a safety net. I had nothing but my own sharp memory and a rising, icy resolve. Sitting in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel, I made a silent, ironclad vow. Every single humiliation, every locked door, every declined card, and every arrogant lie would no longer be a source of pain. It would be evidence. I drove to a rundown strip mall on the edge of town and used the last $80 in my personal emergency cash stash. I rented a private post office box under my maiden name. I walked next door to an electronics discount store and purchased 5 cheap, high-capacity flash drives. I knew Wade was arrogant, but I also knew he was fundamentally lazy. He was obsessed with his new digital shadow company, but he hated dealing with physical paper. He considered manual filing beneath his executive status. I knew for a fact that the old, dusty boxes of original carrier contracts, the handwritten ledger notes from our first 3 years, and the unredacted tax filings were still sitting in the unlit damp storage unit behind the old industrial park. He had simply forgotten to shred them, assuming the digital lockout was entirely sufficient to blind me. That night, armed with a battery-powered portable scanner and a flashlight, I drove to the storage facility. I used a pair of heavy bolt cutters to snap the cheap padlock off the rolling metal door. I sat on the cold concrete floor for 7 straight hours, breathing in the smell of mildew and old cardboard. I methodically fed thousands of pages of irrefutable, physical proof through the glowing slot of the scanner, saving the undeniable history of my stolen life onto a piece of plastic the size of my thumb. I never connected my laptop to our home wireless network again. Wade was not a sophisticated hacker, but he had enough money to hire someone who was, and I could not risk a keylogger or a network monitor seeing my search history. The four walls of my house had become a surveillance zone, so my physical workspace became anywhere the Wi-Fi was free and the faces were anonymous. I spent my mornings huddled in the quiet corner of the Oak Haven Public Library, my screen angled away from the security cameras. In the afternoons, I sat in the sticky booths of a highway diner off Interstate 40, nursing a single cup of black coffee for 4 hours. When the diner closed, I parked my car under the harsh amber lights of a sprawling truck stop, using the complimentary internet connection meant for long-haul drivers. I sat in the driver's seat with my doors locked, the faint rumble of idling diesel engines shaking my windows, while I quietly dismantled my husband's empire. My first breakthrough came from a completely unexpected source. I needed to understand exactly how the internal system logs worked after a user profile was deactivated. I bought a prepaid cellular phone and called Gus Bell. Gus was a freelance information technology contractor we had used years ago, back when we were first migrating our servers. He was a brilliant, socially awkward guy who preferred talking to machines over people. When he answered, I kept my voice incredibly casual, pretending I was just doing a routine compliance audit and had a hypothetical question about administrative permissions. "Hey, Gus," I said, leaning back in my car seat. "If an employee account is completely disabled on a Tuesday, can that specific user profile still generate and approve a digitally signed rate confirmation on a Thursday?" Gus let out a short nasal laugh. "Absolutely not," he said. "Once the Active Directory credentials are revoked, that user cannot authorize anything. If a document shows up with their digital signature dated after the lockout, it means a top-level administrator manually applied the signature file to a new document. The system logs will show the true author in the back-end metadata. It leaves a massive footprint." I thanked him, hung up the burner phone, and immediately opened the files I had salvaged. Using a free metadata extraction tool I downloaded at the library, I started ripping apart the portable document format files Wade had been generating over the last 3 weeks. My stomach dropped as the raw data filled my screen. There were dozens of high-value carrier contracts and vendor agreements bearing my exact electronic signature, all dated and stamped days or even weeks after my email and system access had been permanently severed. Wade was not just freezing me out, he was actively forging my signature to push through fraudulent approvals. Keeping his own hands clean on paper, he was committing wire fraud, and he was using my name to do it. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place during a terrifyingly risky phone call. I needed to prove that Southacre was not an independent startup, but a cloned parasite. I called Donna Price, a senior account manager at the factoring firm that bought our invoices to ensure our truckers got paid quickly. I took a deep breath, channeled the confident, authoritative tone I had used for a decade, and asked her about the new subsidiary packet. "Donna, it is Caitlin," I said smoothly. "I am just updating my compliance binders. Did your team process the new onboarding packet for Southacre Root Partners yet?" Donna did not hesitate. She had no idea I was currently considered an unstable woman on medical leave. "Oh, yes, honey. We pushed it through yesterday morning," she replied cheerfully. "Honestly, it was the easiest approval we have done all month. Wade just sent over the exact same master service agreement and carrier packet Blue Summit uses. He literally just swapped out the logo at the top of the page and changed the tax identification number. We did not even have to run a new risk assessment." I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned entirely white. "That is great to hear. Donna, thank you," I said, and ended the call. I had the motive, and I had the digital forgery, but I needed irrefutable legal proof that the operations were illegally intertwined. I turned my attention to the Uniform Commercial Code public filings and commercial insurance certificates. It took me 3 days of agonizingly slow cross-referencing, matching tiny strings of text. Finally, I found the smoking gun. I pulled the vehicle identification numbers for a fleet of 25 refrigerated trailers that were actively registered and insured under Blue Summit's primary liability policy. Then, I pulled the active load boards I had scraped. Those exact same 25 trucks, utilizing Blue Summit's expensive insurance coverage, were simultaneously listed as dedicated assets executing the highly profitable freight lanes for South Acre. Wade was using our marital company to shoulder 100% of the financial liability and operational risk, while funneling 100% of the pure profit directly into Sloan's Brothers Dummy Corporation. I stopped feeling like a betrayed wife entirely. The grief was gone, replaced by the cold, methodical precision of a prosecutor building a grand jury indictment. I bought a heavy professional legal binder. I did not just print documents, I established an unbreakable chain of custody. I logged every single piece of paper with agonizing detail. I wrote down the exact date of discovery, the time I accessed it, the source IP address if applicable, and the corresponding financial anomaly. I used clear plastic sleeves. I color-coded the tabs, red for forged signatures, blue for stolen freight lanes, yellow for duplicate insurance filings. It was pristine, emotionless, and utterly lethal. But the final, most devastating shock was waiting for me in the county property records. I was doing a routine sweep of our joint liabilities when I noticed a strange inquiry on a credit monitoring report. I pulled the deed and the recent mortgage filings for our marital home, a beautiful 4-bedroom house we had spent 7 years paying down. The document loaded slowly on the library computer. When the text finally sharpened, the breath left my lungs in a violent rush. Wade had taken out a massive commercial line of credit, totaling $650,000, but he had not secured it with the business assets because he was intentionally making the business look worthless. Instead, he had secretly collateralized the loan using the equity in our shared home. He had forged my initials on the secondary authorization pages, just like he had on the freight contracts. The entire horrifying architecture of his plan was finally visible, clear as cut glass. He took the cash from the loan and injected it into Blue Summit to temporarily cover the massive, intentional losses he was causing by shifting all our profitable clients to South Acre. He was artificially keeping the old company on life support, just long enough to reach the divorce settlement table. His goal was absolute financial annihilation. He intended to bankrupt Blue Summit, making my 50% equity stake completely worthless. He intended to bankrupt me, leaving me strapped with half of a $650,000 debt tied to a house that would inevitably be foreclosed upon. And when the dust settled, he and Sloan would walk away clean, holding the incredibly lucrative debt-free South Acre Root Partners. He was not just trying to leave me, he was trying to bury me alive under a mountain of fabricated debt so I could never afford to fight back. I gently closed my laptop, slid it into my battered leather bag, and walked out of the library into the cool evening air. He thought I was just the woman who answered the phones. He was about to find out exactly who built the machine he was trying to steal. I walked into the Eastside Legal Aid Clinic on a rainy Tuesday morning. The waiting room smelled faintly of stale floor wax and old magazines, a stark contrast to the mahogany and leather offices my husband's attorneys occupied. I fully expected to sit across from an exhausted, overworked public defender and be told that my situation was simply a messy, unfortunate domestic dispute. I expected to hear that husbands hiding a few dollars before a separation was par for the course and that I should just prepare to settle. I was assigned to a man named Terrence Cole. He was in his late 50s with tired eyes, wearing a gray suit that had seen better decades. He did not look like the kind of high-powered attorney who struck fear into corporate boardrooms. I sat down in the squeaky plastic chair opposite his desk and slid my heavy, color-coded binder across the scratched laminate surface. "Take your time," I said quietly. He opened the heavy cover. He did not speak for 1 full hour. The only sound in the cramped office was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the crisp, methodical turning of pages. I watched his eyes track the red index cards, mapping the stolen freight lanes, the printed routing numbers, and the metadata logs proving the forged digital signatures. He read every single annotation I had made in the margins. Finally, Terrence closed the binder. He took off his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "Mrs. Vance," Terrence began, his voice gravelly but intensely focused. "I see a lot of angry spouses in this chair. I see a lot of people claiming their partner is cheating or hiding a bonus check. But what you have documented in this binder is not just a bitter divorce. This is systemic financial coercion. This is severe asset dissipation. And based on these property records and the forged authorization forms, this exhibits clear signs of perjury and fraud upon the court." I felt a tight, agonizing knot in my chest loosen just a fraction. Somebody else finally saw it. The gaslighting was over. The paperwork was real. "I want to hire you," I said flatly, keeping my posture entirely rigid. "But my husband froze the joint debit accounts. My personal credit is blocked because he leveraged the house. I have exactly $412 to my name right now." Terrence sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "My standard retainer for a complex corporate divorce involving forensic accounting is $15,000. I cannot take you on as an official client today, but I can tell you exactly how to survive the next 2 weeks so you do not lose the war before it even starts." He grabbed a yellow legal pad and a blue pen. "You are going to file a motion for temporary relief representing yourself. Pro se. The family court judges in this county absolutely despise pro se litigants who use the courtroom as a therapist. Do not write about your broken heart. Do not write about his new girlfriend or the expensive candles she buys. You write like a forensic auditor. You state the timeline. You show the capital flight. You attach Exhibit A, the forged signature. You attach Exhibit B, the parallel routing numbers for his new company. You make it entirely about the math. If the math bleeds, the judge will stop the bleeding." I took his handwritten notes and returned to my car. For 3 straight days, I worked from the driver's seat in the library parking lot, typing furiously on my laptop. I stripped every single ounce of anger, betrayal, and sorrow from my vocabulary. I used cold, undeniable declarative sentences. I laid out the sequence of events with surgical, emotionless precision. I drafted a document that was impossible to dismiss as the ramblings of a scorned woman before I could even drive to the courthouse to print my motion. Wade launched his preemptive strike. I received a thick, heavy envelope at my rented post office box. It was his initial filing, and it was an absolute masterpiece of legal fiction. His attorney had drafted a staggering 90-page document filled with polished, aggressive affidavits. Wade formally claimed our brokerage was operating at a devastating 30% loss for the current quarter. He painted a grim picture of a failing industry, begging the court to understand that the marital estate was nearly bankrupt. He formally categorized my entire decade of grueling labor as sporadic clerical support. He swore under oath that I lacked the fundamental business acumen to comprehend the complex operational mechanisms of the supply chain. Most dangerously, his legal team filed an aggressive motion for a protective order, specifically requesting the judge to severely limit the financial discovery phase. They argued that my demands to audit the corporate bank ledgers were harassing, entirely irrelevant, and a desperate attempt by an estranged, mentally unstable spouse to damage a fragile enterprise. They wanted the book slammed shut and locked before I could legally demand the keys to look inside. He was trying to blindfold the judge before she even entered the courtroom, but Wade made a critical, arrogant miscalculation. He assumed his charm offensive worked on everyone. He assumed the gritty, working-class people who actually moved the freight across the country were loyal to his tailored suits and his golf course handshakes. 2 days after Wade filed his motion, I checked my post office box and found a standard white envelope with a handwritten return address from Georgia. It was from Marcus Hayes, the owner of a mid-sized refrigerated carrier fleet. We had done business together for over 6 years. Inside the envelope was a notarized affidavit. I stood in the dusty post office lobby, the fluorescent lights buzzing above me, and read the single page. Marcus had somehow heard through the tight-knit industry grapevine that Wade was trying to freeze me out by claiming I was just a secretary who answered the phones. Marcus had marched into a local notary office on his own time, without me ever asking him to do so. His sworn statement was beautifully, brutally blunt. It read, "In my 6 years hauling freight for Blue Summit, Wade Vance never once managed my payment disputes, compliance issues, or operational crises. Caitlin Vance is the sole reason my trucks kept moving. On 3 separate occasions, when the brokerage failed to remit payments exceeding $80,000 due to Mr. Vance's administrative negligence, Caitlin Vance personally reconstructed the billing matrices and saved my entire fleet from default. She is not clerical support. She is the absolute operational architect of that business. It was a golden bullet. It was a third-party, completely unbiased vendor voluntarily swearing under penalty of perjury that Wade's entire legal narrative was a calculated fabrication. I carefully slid the affidavit into my binder and labeled it as Exhibit C. I filed my pro se motion at the county clerk's office the following morning. The clerk behind the thick glass window took one look at the formal allegations of forged property deeds and unauthorized asset transfers, and her eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. When a spouse alleges that marital funds are being actively liquidated and shifted into shadow accounts, the judicial system suddenly stops moving at its usual glacial pace. Within 48 hours, I received a formal stamped notice from the court. The family court judge was not going to wait 3 months for a standard preliminary hearing. Because the money was continuously in motion, and the allegations of fraud were severe, the court scheduled an expedited, emergency hearing in exactly 14 days. The divorce was no longer a slow, agonizing negotiation over a house and a car. It had become a high-stakes, terrifying sprint. Wade thought he had already crossed the finish line and claimed the prize. He had no idea I was bringing a bulldozer to the track, and he was standing right in my way. Exactly 48 hours before the judge was scheduled to strike her gavel, Wade attempted his final maneuver to sweep me off the chessboard. The delivery arrived via a private courier at my rented post office box. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope containing his absolute final settlement offer. He wanted to starve me out before I could ever stand in that courtroom and make my case. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, the engine idling, and read the aggressively worded document. His attorney was offering me the title to my 7-year-old sport utility vehicle and a lump sum cash payment of exactly $45,000. In exchange for this supposedly generous payout, the contract demanded I sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a permanent waiver of any legal right to request financial discovery. But the most revealing sentence was buried on the 4th page. The clause explicitly required me to release any and all claims against South Acre Route Partners, a corporate entity the document casually described as an entirely unrelated, independent third-party vendor. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to build a legal firewall around his stolen loot. He was offering me a handful of loose change to turn my back on a multi-million-dollar heist. Wade did not orchestrate this strategy alone. I knew exactly who was whispering in his ear because I had found the script. Weeks earlier, while scouring the cached files of a shared cloud drive Wade had forgotten to unlink from my old reading tablet, I unearthed a document simply titled Hearing Strategy Notes. The author properties in the file metadata listed Sloan Barrett. She was not just inserting herself into his home and redecorating his living room. She was actively coaching him on how to destroy me in a court of law. Reading Sloane's notes was like looking through a window into a sociopathic mind. She had compiled a bulleted list instructing Wade on exactly how to behave in front of the judge. Keep your tone clinical and exhausted. One bullet point read, frame Caitlin as a bitter, unemployed housewife who is lashing out because she cannot handle the transition. Another note specifically directed him to weaponize industry jargon. Whenever she makes a claim about the business, respond using highly technical terms. Talk about accessorial liability, drayage bottlenecks, and deadhead miles. Remind the court that she does not possess the vocabulary to understand a modern supply chain. Make her look like she is desperately clinging to a world she does not belong in. I did not delete the document. I simply added it to my arsenal. I spent the entire day before the hearing transforming my small dining room table into a war room. I distilled thousands of pages of raw data into 3 massive, heavy-duty black binders. I ruthlessly eliminated anything that sounded emotional, petty, or speculative. I built a fortress of pure, undeniable mathematics. Binder 1 was dedicated entirely to system access and administrative control. It contained the exact timestamps of my digital lockout, the sworn affidavit from the veteran carrier, and the technical logs proving I was the sole architect of the operational matrix, Binder. 2 mapped the diverted cash flow. It held the parallel lane sheets, the duplicated factoring company packets, and the post office box registrations linking the two companies. Binder 3 was the most lethal. It contained the metadata extractions proving the forged electronic signatures. Once the binders were perfectly indexed, I began my physical preparation. I stood in front of the hallway mirror for 3 solid hours. I watched my own face, training my muscles to remain entirely slack. I knew the stereotype they were trying to force upon me. They wanted the judge to see a hysterical, scorned woman crying over a younger mistress. I refused to give them a single tear. I practiced my responses. Speaking to my own reflection, I answered imaginary questions using brief, razor-sharp sentences. I built that matrix. I managed that freight lane. That signature was applied after my access was revoked. I stripped every ounce of humanity and hesitation from my voice. I knew that a person who speaks very little, but speaks with absolute, verifiable truth, is infinitely more terrifying than a person who fills a room with loud, empty words. The sun had long since set, and the house was draped in absolute silence. It was 1 o'clock in the morning. I was running a final validation check on the metadata extraction files in Binder 3, double-checking the source codes. I focused my tired eyes on a massive rate confirmation document, a contract that had effectively transferred a massive pharmaceutical account over to South Acre. The document bore my electronic signature, indicating my formal executive approval. I traced the origination Internet Protocol address attached to the digital stamp. I expected it to trace back to Wade's private server at the downtown office, but the sequence of numbers did not match the commercial grid. I ran the address through a geolocation registry. The location pinned perfectly to a rural broadband provider near Lake Oconee. It was the exact location of Wade's private, secluded lake house. I checked the timestamp. The document had been signed and executed at exactly 2:14 in the morning on a Tuesday. I distinctly remembered that specific Tuesday. I had been fast asleep in our marital bed, and Wade had told me he was spending the night on the office couch to manage a West Coast shipping crisis. He had been at the lake house, likely with Sloan, forging my name in the dead of night to steal my life's work. A secondary, sickening realization hit me. If he was lying about his location that night, what else was actively crumbling? My eyes burned from staring at the screen. But I opened a new browser tab and navigated to my health insurance provider's portal. I typed in my credentials to check the status of a routine prescription I needed to refill. A bright red banner flashed across the top of the screen. The status read, "Terminated." The effective cancellation date was listed as exactly 35 days ago. A fresh wave of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. In Wade's preliminary sworn affidavit to the court, the very document requesting the judge to limit my financial discovery, he had explicitly promised he was maintaining the financial status quo. He had sworn under penalty of perjury that he was actively sustaining all family obligations, including my medical coverage, to prove he was a responsible, benevolent provider. He had canceled my healthcare policy 5 days before he even filed that affidavit. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I flipped to the very back of Binder 2. Reviewing the commercial property records one last time, I stared at the promissory note for the massive line of credit Wade had secured against our marital home. I looked at the specific draw request, a document authorizing the bank to release exactly $125,000 into a checking account I could not access. Right there, on the bottom right corner of the page, were my handwritten initials, not a digital stamp, but a physical forgery of my handwriting. My knees actually buckled. I gripped the edge of the dining room table, lowering myself into the nearest chair. The sheer, suffocating audacity of his actions pressed down on my chest. He had leveraged the roof over my head to fund his mistress's shadow company, and he had faked my handwriting to do it. The physical toll of the betrayal crashed over me like a tidal wave. I felt a violent rush of nausea. I reached blindly across the table and grabbed my cellular phone. My thumb hovered over Wade's contact name. The impulse to call him was overwhelming. I wanted to scream into the receiver. I wanted to tell him I knew everything, to hear the panic in his voice, to shatter his arrogant peace of mind right then and there. I wanted to ruin his night, but I stopped. I stared at the glowing screen of the phone, watching the seconds tick by. If I called him, I would surrender my only advantage. I would give him 8 hours to call his lawyers, to formulate a lie, to manufacture a technical excuse. I would be playing right into Sloane's strategy, acting like the erratic, emotional woman they wanted me to be. I slowly set the phone face down on the wooden table. I picked up a thick black marker. I opened binder 1, turned to the very first blank page of my yellow legal notepad, and wrote a single sentence in large, bold letters. Make him explain it out loud. I closed the binder, turned off the overhead light, and waited for the sun to rise. 14 days had passed since I first stood in that courtroom. The air inside the Oakhaven County Family Court felt exactly the same, thick with the scent of polished wood and impending judgment. I sat alone at the respondent table. My 3 heavy black binders sat perfectly aligned in front of me, exactly parallel to the edge of the oak wood. Wade strolled through the double doors a few minutes later, exuding the same manufactured confidence. He wore a different suit today, a rich navy blue, but he wore the same arrogant smile. He leaned down to his silver-haired attorney, ensuring his voice carried perfectly across the quiet room to where the court clerk was sorting files. "It really is a shame she still cannot afford a lawyer," Wade said, shaking his head with mock pity. "This would go so much faster if she had someone to explain the basics to her." I did not blink. I did not turn my head. I simply rested my hands flat on the cover of the first binder. Judge Miriam Holt took the bench exactly on the hour. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She looked down at the massive stack of papers Wade's attorney had filed, then looked over at my neat, silent table. "Counselor, you may proceed," Judge Holt said, her voice dry and echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. Wade's attorney stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He launched into the exact script Sloane had written for him. "Your Honor, we are here today because my client is desperately trying to protect a fragile, failing enterprise from a spouse who fundamentally misunderstands corporate finance." Mrs. Vance served in a strictly clerical capacity. She was, for all intents and purposes, a data entry clerk. She does not comprehend net profit margins. She does not understand interstate brokerage law. And she certainly lacks the sophisticated financial literacy required to grasp the complex valuation metrics of a distressed business asset. She is lashing out because she cannot accept the economic realities of the freight market. Judge Holt did not nod. She did not take notes. She simply watched the attorney speak until he finished his theatrical opening. Then, she turned her gaze directly to me. She bypassed the lawyer entirely. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Holt said, leaning forward slightly, "let us bypass the rhetoric and examine the operational structure of Blue Summit Freight Group. Who created the initial carrier compliance protocols for the company?" I sat up perfectly straight. I kept my voice loud, clear, and completely devoid of emotion. "I created those protocols, Your Honor. Who maintained the freight claims and the cargo liability policies? I maintained those policies. Who held the master administrative rights to the routing software and the financial ledgers? I held those rights," I answered, my eyes locked on the judge. "Until exactly 7:15 in the morning on a Tuesday, when my access was manually revoked without my consent." Wade shifted violently in his leather chair. The clinical precision of my answers was rattling his cage. He leaned forward, aggressively interrupting the flow of the proceeding. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the respondent is intentionally confusing basic, low-level administrative data entry with high-level executive strategy," Wade said, his voice rising in pitch. He was deploying the exact jargon Sloane had fed him. "She simply typed in the numbers I gave her. She does not understand accessorial liability matrices. She cannot comprehend the strategic necessity of mitigating deadhead capacity during severe market contractions or navigating drayage bottlenecks at the coastal ports. He looked around the room, expecting the complex terminology to hang in the air like an impenetrable fog. He expected me to shrink back, intimidated by the vocabulary. I did not wait for the judge to ask for clarification. I spoke directly to the bench, my voice cutting through his bluster like a scalpel. Your Honor, accessorial liability simply refers to standard extra charges from a trucker, like a tarp fee or a detention delay, I said, translating his weaponized words into plain, undeniable English. Deadhead capacity means a truck is driving empty without a paying load. Drayage bottlenecks mean there is a traffic jam at a shipping port. He is trying to use industry jargon to make the business sound failing and overly complex. The market is not contracting, and Blue Summit is not failing. He is simply intentionally diverting our most profitable shipments to a shadow company to manufacture a paper loss. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Wade's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. His sophisticated smokescreen had just been blown away by a woman he claimed only answered the phones. Judge Holt's eyes narrowed behind her thick glasses. She reached into the thick file Wade's attorney had provided. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Mr. Vance," Judge Holt said, her tone suddenly dropping several degrees. "In your sworn affidavit, you submitted this rate confirmation document as proof that Blue Summit lost a major dedicated manufacturing account due to poor market conditions. You swore under oath that this cancellation was received and processed through normal business channels." I opened the third binder. I turned to the second tab. "Your Honor," I interjected smoothly, "if you turn to the second tab in the third binder I provided to the court, you will see the extracted file properties for that exact rate confirmation document." Judge Holt flipped open my binder. Her eyes scanned the page, reading the raw metadata I had extracted in the library parking lot. "That document was not processed through normal business channels," I stated. "The digital signature on that file was inserted after my administrative access was locked. Furthermore, the Internet Protocol address attached to the file creation proves that the document was generated at exactly 2:14 in the morning, originating from a private rural broadband network tied to a lake house owned solely by my husband." Wade's attorney knocked his expensive silver pen off the table. It clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He did not bend down to pick it up. Judge Holt stared at the metadata. The air in the room felt incredibly thin, as if the oxygen was being slowly sucked out through the air conditioning vents. "Let us look deeper into these financial diversions you mentioned. Mrs. Vance," Judge Holt said, her voice now entirely flat and dangerous. "Please refer to the fourth tab in the second binder." "Your Honor," I instructed, feeling the absolute power shift inch by glorious inch into my hands. "This is the itemized transaction ledger for South Acre Root Partners, the newly formed limited liability company that is currently absorbing Blue Summit's vanished revenue." Judge Holt turned the heavy pages. "My husband's legal team has characterized the massive capital flight from our joint accounts as legitimate, necessary corporate expenditures to save a dying company," I continued, never taking my eyes off Wade. "I asked the court to review the expenditures categorized on that ledger as client development." Judge Holt read the lines silently, then read them aloud for the record. $4,500 for a luxury boutique hotel in Atlanta, a $2,000 dinner at a steakhouse, and a wire transfer for $9,000. She stopped reading and looked over her glasses at Wade. "Your Honor," I said, delivering the final, crushing blow. "That $9,000 wire transfer was not for client development. I cross-referenced the receiving account. That exact sum was used to pay the first and last month's security deposit for a luxury apartment lease. The name on that residential lease is Sloan Barrett, the woman currently sitting in the third row of your gallery." A sharp collective intake of breath echoed through the courtroom. In the back row, Sloan Barrett stood up abruptly, her face entirely drained of color, her ivory silk blouse suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Wade gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning pure white, the arrogant smirk completely erased from his face. Judge Holt did not yell. She did not bang her gavel. She simply took off her thick-rimmed glasses and placed them deliberately on her wooden desk. The silence stretched until it felt like the walls were going to cave in. She turned her head to the side, looking down at the woman operating the stenograph machine. "Madam Court Reporter," Judge Holt said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper that commanded every corner of the room. "Please retrieve the transcript from the first 10 minutes of this hearing. I want you to read back the petitioner's exact sworn testimony. I want to hear exactly what Mr. Vance said regarding who specifically controls the marital finances and who specifically controls the digital security passwords." The rhythmic clicking of the stenograph machine stopped. The court reporter, a woman with graying hair who had likely seen decades of liars cycle through this room, cleared her throat. She scrolled back through her digital feed and began reading in a flat, mechanical voice that somehow made my husband's words sound even more absurd. Wade's own words hung heavily in the stale courtroom air. He had stated on the permanent record that I was entirely incapable of understanding a basic spreadsheet, a woman who simply answered the ringing telephones. Yet, in the exact same breath, under the strict penalty of perjury, he had aggressively confessed that he had to personally sever my master credentials to the entire corporate server to protect the business infrastructure. The paradox was glaring and undeniable. If I was merely a low-level data entry clerk, why did I possess the architectural keys to the entire digital kingdom? And more importantly, why were those critical administrative keys snatched away only 48 hours after I confronted him about a diverted $90,000 invoice? I did not give his high-priced attorney a single second to spin the contradiction. I delivered the final strike, laying out the timeline with the cold, unyielding precision of a surgeon. "Your Honor," I stated, my voice completely steady, echoing against the dark wood paneling. "The chronology of these events is not an unfortunate coincidence. It is a documented confession. On the 4th of October, I identified a diverted payment. On the 6th of October, my administrative access was permanently terminated, and my corporate email was erased from the directory. On the 9th of October, the 3 most profitable shipping lanes were seamlessly transferred to South Acre. And on the 14th of October, 5 full days after I was locked out of the building, my electronic signature was fraudulently applied to a massive liability waiver to finalize the theft." Wade's $600 an hour attorney sprang to his feet, his heavy leather chair scraping violently against the floorboards. The smooth, predatory confidence he had carried into the room was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, sweating energy of a man trying to plug a bursting dam with his bare hands. He reached up and loosened his silk tie. "Objection, Your Honor," the attorney practically shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "The respondent is testifying without a proper foundation and making wild, unsubstantiated accusations of federal wire fraud to distract from the simple dissolution of a troubled marriage." Judge Holt slammed her hand flat against the heavy wood of her desk. The sound cracked through the room like a whip, instantly silencing the panicked attorney. She did not even look at him. "Sit down, counselor," Judge Holt commanded, her voice vibrating with an absolute terrifying authority. "This is no longer a simple domestic dispute over who gets to keep the dining room table. We are now navigating the incredibly serious territory of perjury, gross asset concealment, and the fraudulent manipulation of commercial documents submitted directly into my court." Judge Holt shifted her gaze to Wade. He had shrunk back into his chair, his broad shoulders slumped. His expensive navy blue suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. All the color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. Then, the judge delivered the line that effectively ended the war. "Mr. Vance," Judge Holt said, her tone dripping with freezing contempt, "if you retain absolute control over the marital funds, and you still have the audacity to sit in my courtroom and state on the public record that Mrs. Vance cannot afford an attorney, then the court will gladly solve that problem for her right now." She did not wait for a response. She picked up her silver pen and began writing orders with furious, heavy strokes. I am ordering an immediate, mandatory advancement of legal fees. Mr. Vance, you will wire $50,000 into an escrow account designated by Mrs. Vance by 5 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Furthermore, I am appointing an independent forensic accounting firm, at your sole expense, to conduct a comprehensive, line-by-line audit of both Blue Summit Freight Group and South Acre Route Partners. I am immediately freezing all commercial lines of credit tied to the marital estate, prohibiting any discretionary withdrawals exceeding $500, and placing a strict, legally binding injunction against the deletion of any digital or physical corporate records. Judge Holt looked back down at her clerk, handing over the written orders. Let the record reflect that the court is completely reopening the financial discovery phase. Based on the extensively documented evidence of asset dissipation presented today, the court finds the respondent, Caitlin Vance, to be the highly credible party regarding the financial operations of this estate. In that single, breathtaking moment, the absolute power dynamic in the room violently inverted. Wade was no longer the untouchable king dictating the terms of my surrender. He was a man trapped under a blinding spotlight, facing a forensic dissection of every lie he had ever told. He was not deciding my fate anymore. He was begging for his own survival. I heard a soft rustling sound from the back of the room. I did not turn around to look, but I listened to the quick, rhythmic tapping of expensive high heels, retreating hastily down the center aisle. The heavy oak doors creaked open and clicked shut. Sloane Barrett had quietly slipped out of the gallery before the gavel even fell to close the session. When the stolen money stops flowing, the counterfeit loyalty usually evaporates right along with it. The aftermath of that day did not look like a cinematic explosion. It looked like the slow, agonizing, and entirely realistic grind of the world catching up to a liar. True consequences are administrative. Within 4 weeks, the commercial bank managing Blue Summit's debt caught wind of the court-ordered forensic audit and panicked. They instantly froze Wade's operational capital to protect their own investments. His major manufacturing clients received formal subpoenas regarding their redirected payments to South Acre, and they immediately canceled their lucrative contracts, desperate to distance their brands from a pending federal fraud investigation. Wade spent his days trapped in windowless conference rooms for endless depositions, forced to watch the empire he tried to steal crumble into ash, simply because he had alienated and humiliated the only person who actually knew how to run it. I walked back into the East Side Legal Aid Clinic a week later and officially handed Terrence Cole a retainer check for $15,000. We did not settle for a used sport utility vehicle and a pathetic monthly allowance. We dismantled Wade's shadow corporation piece by piece, liquidating the stolen assets and forcing him into a corner where he had no choice but to surrender the lion's share of the legitimate marital estate just to avoid a criminal referral to the prosecutor's office. 9 months later, I walked into a sleek, modern high-rise building in the center of the downtown financial district. I was not there to answer ringing telephones, fetch coffee, or silently fix someone else's administrative disasters. I had been hired as the Senior Director of Logistics Auditing at Vanguard Compliance Partners, a high-level corporate oversight firm. They offered me a base salary of $160,000 a year, specifically because of the terrifying, undeniable competency and investigative rigor I had demonstrated while legally dismantling my ex-husband's fraud network. I walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway on my first day and stopped in front of a heavy, frosted glass door. There, printed in crisp, elegant silver lettering, was my name, Caitlin Vance. It was not hidden behind a husband's inflated ego. It was not used as a punchline at a company barbecue. It was standing proudly on its own, exactly where it belonged, demanding the respect it had always deserved. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and I would love for you to comment below and tell me where you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. Please subscribe to the Amelia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support this channel by liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.